Background checks. They're like the most important thing in the history of ever, talking to Democrats particularly. Not just background checks, but expanded background checks. Super, double, pinky swear, expanded background checks. They're talked about all the time as the ultimate way to stop violence behind gun confiscation anyway. But of course, these checks only work if law enforcement agencies bother to follow up on leads and address red flags, which, in the case of Parkland, Florida, they inexplicably did not do. But amazingly, the failure of law enforcement to do their job in this case does not dissuade Democrats from still claiming that it's all about those government background checks. So, knowing this, I mean, you would think that Democrats, of all people, would be all about performing background checks when they're needed, since they're such a huge deal, right? No, you're wrong, because congressional documents show that nearly 50 Democrats waived background checks for their precious Pakistani IT aides that were accused of hacking. You remember the Awan brothers, right? Because they allegedly made, and I quote, unauthorized access to congressional data, and then they tried to flee the country. One of them was like trying to leave with hard drives. This is such a typical Washington situation. I mean, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, these are her aides, and she wants bullet background checks, for crying out loud. They want higher taxes for everyone except themselves. They want government health care for everyone, but, you know, they want to choose their own plans. And they want prudent and complete total background checks on everyone else, except when they don't. And it proves another point. One that is so important to understand about solutions like background checks as a deterrent or preventative measures when it comes to keeping Americans safe. Government is not a machine. It is comprised of people. People who have their own agendas, people who have their own biases, people who have their own incompetencies, and, as we often see, people who have their own rules from time to time. Rules that they don't believe applies to them, even as they demand that it applies to you. Democrats, given their decision to ignore their own rules about background checks, are the kings and queens of double standards. For more on this, I'm joined by the Daily Caller's Luke Rosiak, who has been following this story for, I think, well over a year, and he finally shoved it onto the world stage, and everyone's jaws hit the floor because they couldn't believe this is happening. Luke, great work as always. So I just want to make sure that I have this correct. Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who is the woman who wants background checks and all of that for ammunition now, doesn't think it's at all required to have background checks for Pakistani aides who are brought in and they have access to sensitive information and pretty much email and everything else, correct?
Correct. If there's one thing Democrats care about more than imposing gun control, it's cybersecurity. At least they claim. They're constantly talking about Russia and hacking. But it turns out that Debbie Wasserman Schultz herself is the one that brought the fox into the henhouse by bringing this guy Imran Awan, who was completely unvetted, who had massive red flags in his background. And she hired him. And then soon after, all these other members, seemingly because Wasserman Schultz was telling them to, because there was a lot of Florida members and others, they started hiring his relatives who had even less qualifications and more red flags than he did. So soon, 1 in 5 House Democrats, this one Pakistani family can read all of their emails and data. And this really comes back to Wasserman Schultz and a failure to perform background checks, that the House policy says that members of Congress shall perform background checks on IT administrators because they can read all their emails. And every single one of these members, astonishingly, did not run these background checks despite the policy.